sort of eruption of theories of a theory of knowledge. So, so we, anyway.
First of all, thank you so much for that was every moment of that was important and compelling. I need these questions in the spirit of your own question about the spaces in between nothing and subjectivity, or even in between nothing and something, in a similar way. Um, if what's at stake is a capacity to desire or not to desire differentiation, is a desire for differentiation necessarily already a desire for sovereignty, power, subjectivity? Or could there be, and at the end you seem to be implying that it was already a desire for subjectivity, and is it?
If I did imply that, I didn't mean to, because what I want to say is maybe I could, maybe, I mean, my impulse is to make a distinction between differentiation and maybe individuation. Okay. It's really, what I'm interested in is something like what one might think of as a kind of unleashing of differentiation. And my understanding of sovereignty is that it's all about the regulation of differentiation. So, um, so it is in the interest of this sort of general differentiation, and not just general, but a generative, differentiation that I'm interested in. And I guess ultimately, the stuff that I'm working on now, the sort of foundation of it is in an attempt to understand historically what I think happens maybe like in Kant's work. It gets crystallized there, and it gets, as crystallized and codified there. What I would call, a kind of racialization of differentiation, um, and and so what that historic maneuver, in the interest, which then, when Kant says, the imagination in its lawless freedom must have its wings severely clipped by the understanding. And when he says that, it strikes me that it connects up to certain things that he's working through constantly, in the 1780s. Constantly thinking through a way of both acknowledging the generative force of a certain kind of what he would call a kind of an imaginative lawlessness. And at the same, so he wants to acknowledge that generative force. It's not possible not to acknowledge it. But at the same time, he's desperately concerned with how it could be properly regulated. And I think that like racialization is one of the primary ways that he constructs to regulate it. And that's this fundamental relation between racialization and sovereignty, right? And so, the again, this is part of what I think is so important in Frank's work, is to pinpoint the necessity of spatiotemporal coherence as literally the kind of, I call it, the cosmological foundation of a certain kind of sovereignty, and to recognize almost that it is immediately racialized and understood that way. So that everything, so that if one is interested in something like the unleashing or the liberation, if you will, of difference, it's not possible to do that work by way of some kind of recovery or even some kind of democratization of sovereignty. And if civil society is the place where that democratization of sovereignty takes place, then again, relegation to the hold of the ship, relegation to the outside of civil society, is also precisely a kind of exilic chance and opportunity, right? To literally experiment with other modes of being in the world, if if you want to use that term, that that are about, you know, uh, these sort of new experiments in differentiation. I mean, and there's these moments again, like in Frank's work, where it sounds so much like Deleuze writing about Hume, right? That moment where he's talking about if we bracket these nouns that we use as a kind of as a force of habit, you know, and you know Hume says similar things that Deleuze says, and because there are certain people who are thinking outside like that, okay, and you know, or literally, you know, Foucault said the thought of the outside operates in this way, but it is a thought which is outside, you know, of the structures of civil society, whether which is, you know, all bound up with this sort of dispersion or democratization of sovereignty, to use this kind of really smart, great thinker named Angela Metropolis. She talks about that in the phrase. But anyway, that's, so yeah, if I said that, I didn't mean to say it.
No, I get, that totally works for me, and I get now that I didn't hear it, rather than that you didn't say it. But I think what we're left with then is this very delicate interpretive task pulling apart the desire for differentiation and the desire for individuation,
Yeah.
which in many places it's going to be hard.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right, and it requires it requires like levels of precision that that uh, that I certainly don't achieve very often. But I'm trying to always tell my students, man, my grads, they get so sick of me. They call me precise because there's actually this great rapper called MC Precise Just Ice. Y'all remember? Anyway, y'all don't remember. but because I'm constantly talking about precision, you know, because these are these things where you want to, you know. So yeah, it's. I appreciate the question very much because I really am sort of desperate to make sure that I don't, you know, that I to try to get some of this stuff, you know, right. So.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful talk. Our only question, kind of reminding us of our own working on this, and your reflections about your grandfather. It made me remember the sculptural installation that you showed at the beginning. And so, like, what is, you know, there's the kind of earlier question about how do you think about thinking or theorizing through different kinds of cultural forms. So we see the kind of poetry and language, the sound and language. But when you get to kind of material objects, right, these kind of three-dimensional material objects, you know, what does that then do? Because I thought that once you started to talk about thingliness, you were going to take us back to that sculpture, because you kind of just showed this slide and didn't really talk about it. So can you kind of, you know, rethink this question back through that sculpture?
Yeah. Actually, maybe that's what I can talk about tomorrow or Wednesday, because well, Thornton Dial is this kind of amazing figure, right? Do y'all, I mean, he's kind of the emblematic figure of so-called outsider art or untaught, you know, sort of self-taught art. And you know, certainly that's one, you know, very myopic kind of way to look at it. But another, maybe a little bit more accurate way to look at it is that he operates within, you know, a kind of Afro-American and more generally Afro-diasporic visual tradition, which it turns out is just as rich and just as complex. And when I say visual, I mean both, you know, sort of painterly in terms of image production, but also at the level of the production of material objects in this way. And it's just as rich and just as complex as a musical tradition, for instance. And this is a story which needs to be worked through and told. And it's interesting that I don't know that the contemporary art world is a discursive space where this story can be told for a bunch of different reasons. Um, but what's interesting about Thornton Dial is that he's got a powerful discursive presence that extends into the realm of language from the objects that he makes. Um, and it plays itself out at the level of his titles, which are extraordinarily rich and poetic. And I think I love the title of that piece as much as I love the piece, although the image of it, you can't, doesn't do it justice. It's probably 3/4 as long as this table, these two tables put together, and like maybe this high. And it's so intricate, and it's probably, like, so that the dimensionality of it is massive, and the intricateness of it, using this sort of wrought iron, and there's bones, and it's just an amazing, it's just an amazingly complex piece, which evolves from, on the one hand, his movement and working within this visual tradition, but also the specific training that he received as a steel worker in Bessemer, Alabama, which is a steel town. And so what I guess I'm trying to say is everything that I think he learns and knows is at least gestured towards and indicated in the title, a monument to the minds of the little Negro steelworkers, right? And I think about my grandfather in relation to that, because I feel like he's operating under by way of a similar theory of intelligence or smartness, let's say, that plays itself out at the level of hands and a certain kind of knowing sensuality, right? But the other thing is that, well, um, what I was going to talk about tomorrow, to finish up that section of paper, is the phrase "little Negro" is the one, because I was going to try to get at this stuff that Fanon does in, the Negroan language with pidgin and la petty neg, because I think it's connected up to some stuff that Rediker gets at in that first, opening of the slave ship, and then Linebar gets at it in different ways in All the Atlantic Mountains Shook. And what we're talking about is like these modes of knowing and knowledge, sound production, um, the formations of language that emerge in the whole, as fantasy, where fantasy implies not only thinking about flight or freedom, but also in a musical sense as a kind of fantasy as counterpoint, fantasy as this amazing mixture and differentiation of voices, this kind of multiphonic field. So, but to me, that phrase quasi una fantasia, Beethoven uses it talking about the 13th